I'll say hello, everyone. I'm Paris. I guess you know that if you're kind of attending. Um, I host a podcast called Tech Won't Save Us. I write a lot about technology. And I wrote a book called Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation, which is sort of what my presentation is kind of based on. Based on hearing your responses, it sounds like it's pretty good weather up there in Toronto these days. I'm here in Newfoundland. I'm not in Toronto, but I'll say that the weather's been pretty nice here as well this week. It looks like we're finally starting to get some spring. So it's pretty nice, certainly grateful for that. Um, so yeah, I guess let's just jump into it, and obviously happy to take questions afterward. Um, so I want to start by just talking a bit about automobility and the automobile itself, right? Because the book looks a lot at what Silicon Valley has proposed for the future of transportation, in the past 15 years or so. But the book also goes back further than that to look at the emergence of the automobile in the North American and particularly, the American city, and where that actually comes from. And so, this is a technology that really emerges at the end of the 1800s and really starts to kind of take off in the early 1900s. And, take off to a certain degree. It's still not kind of like a mass means of transportation or anything like that. But in that moment, as the automobile is starting to roll out, there's a lot of tension that's happening in cities across North America. And that is because, people are used to getting around in a certain way. There are many different types of transportation that are kind of sharing the roads in cities, whether it's people who are walking, people who are on bicycles, people who are using streetcars, people who are in horse-drawn carriages, and all of these things move relatively slowly so they can sort of navigate this space together. But then the automobile comes along and it works a bit differently than those other forms of transportation, right? It can go faster, and that means that it disrupts this norm that existed. And there quickly becomes a tension where, you have a lot of people who are all of a sudden getting injured or dying as automobiles become more prevalent on the streets. And that, that requires some kind of figuring out what the future of transportation is going to be. And so, to kind of make a very long story short, there are a lot of people who are protesting against this, who are trying to stop it. And then there's also, a lobby, a group of commercial interests who are very interested in getting the automobile to really take over the streets and the cities, to have our cities kind of be rebuilt and built in such a way that people are encouraged to drive. And as we know, that's ultimately what takes hold. And so this transition is a contested process, because vehicles are owned by the wealthy, especially in this period of time where there's not very many on the streets. And the people who are being most injured and most harmed by the rollout is lower income people, is the working classes of the city, right? And there's many more of them than there are rich people, and they're sort of pushing back. And so they use the media and, they have public ad campaigns and things like that to try to change perceptions, to demonize jaywalkers, people who kind of walk out onto the street who, that was something that they could always do before that. But all of a sudden, this was something that you couldn't do, right? And a jay, of course, was kind of like a hick, right? The idea was, you don't understand how things work in the city because you're walking at these places that are not crosswalks. And so, in the kind of long story of this, cars sort of had to be made compulsory, and that was done by taking away the alternatives that people had, by building communities in such a way so that you had to drive to get around. And now, a century on from that kind of fight, we can see the impacts of that, right? Certainly, we have a lot of deaths and injuries that come from automobile crashes. Certainly those numbers are really significant in the United States. Over 40,000 people a year die die because of cars. I guess we should put it that way. In Canada, that's over 1,700 people as of 2 years ago. And it's nearly 8,000 people who sustain serious injuries because of cars. On top of that, of course, people lose significant time stuck in traffic. because, we've built a society where most people need cars to get around. And that also has negative health effects from the time spent sitting in the car, but also from the way that we build communities in such a way so that you kind of need to drive to get anywhere. And, there's less incentive or, kind of the ability to walk and have kind of physical activity in your day-to-day life is sort of taken away. There's also a large environmental footprint, which we're all very aware of as we hear the government making stronger and stronger pushes toward electric vehicles. The emissions that come from that, emissions are the second largest, transportation is the second largest source of sectoral emissions in Canada after, of course, oil and gas. It also takes away green space and has other impacts on our communities. There's, of course, an inequity that comes with that. Who actually benefits from this transport system, who is most disadvantaged by how we build transportation. Low income people obviously have a lot less access to transportation, various marginalized communities, because of the system that we've created. And of course, there are high public costs that come with that. All of the sprawl is actually very expensive because you have a low population density to keep, funding all of the services that we expect and that we rely on when we build our communities in a way that is kind of dependent on the car. And so, for the past 15 years, the tech industry has kind of been responding to these problems, right? They recognize that these problems exist. And so, they've had a whole load of solutions for how technology is going to solve this problem, whether it's the Boring Company, which is the image there in the top left. It was an early concept for the Boring Company, certainly nothing like what it looks like in Las Vegas today. The autonomous car, which is the one there on the top right, the idea not just that the car is going to drive itself, but it'll turn into this space where you can work and have calls and do whatever. Of course, the flying car, pushed most notably by Uber, but many other companies were involved in that as well. Uber has sold off that division. You don't hear much about that anymore. And of course, Uber and Lyft and the ride hailing services are also a very common piece of this. And they're, of course, the most kind of the one that has actually had the most impact on the way that we get around today. And so if we look at kind of the tech industry's approach to transportation, what we see, when I kind of observe what they've actually done and what they've proposed, is that there's a big focus on personal grievances, right? So even though these ideas are promoted as kind of solving a whole load of issues in the transportation system, really the core idea, what they're really responding to is a grievance that they've held about the transportation system. So Uber is, of course, a response to the fact that Travis Kalanick was having a hard time getting a black car, and Lyft and the Uber X service that follows is a response to the difficulty of getting a taxi. And of course, if we look at many of Elon Musk's ideas for transportation, in particular the Boring Company, that's a response to being stuck in traffic and wanting to find a way of getting out of traffic. And that's what he's most concerned about seeing addressed, right? And so these are really big ideas in many cases. The autonomous vehicle is going to completely transform transportation, solve all these issues, but are often not grounded in transport fundamentals. So someone like Elon Musk will argue that a concept like induced demand, where, if we make more investments in a particular form of transportation, that is going to induce demand for it, that's going to encourage more people to take that form of transportation. He would say that something like that doesn't exist. So it doesn't matter if we keep investing more in automobiles and automotive forms of transportation, because that won't encourage people to take that form of transportation even more. There's also the belief that technology alone will solve transport problems. So again, let's forget about this century of history and the decisions that we've made over the past century that have made so many people dependent on cars and that have created all of these issues that I outlined before that have come with that form of transportation. Forget all those difficult kind of political decisions, the legacies of those decisions. All we need is some new technology. We can implement that in our cars. Boom, that'll solve the problem, right? And all of these problems. That's really not realistic, right? And then the other piece of this is, of course, over-promising and under-delivering. There's this core idea that they have, and then they have to build out kind of a whole, kind of fantasy of what the solution and what the future around this is going to be, right? And then, of course, they naturally under-deliver on those things, but in the process, they distract us, and I'll come back to that. And so there's a quote that always seems quite relevant to me when I think about this. Andre Gors, who's a social philosopher, he said I believe this was in the 70s, he said this: the car has made the big city uninhabitable. It has made it stinking, noisy, suffocating, dusty, so congested that nobody wants to go out in the evening anymore. Thus, since cars have killed the city, we need faster cars to escape on superhighways to suburbs that are even farther away. What an impeccable circular argument. Give us more cars so that we can escape the destruction caused by cars. And really, this is the core of what I see as the tech industry's response to these problems in the transport system, right? It's like, not let's really address the core of the problem here. Let's just see how we can put new technologies and new forms of automobiles out onto the roads that will solve these problems created by the automobile and our dependence on it in the first place. And so I want to provide a specific example to kind of ground this for you. We can look at the self-driving car, of course, which was promoted as something that was going to solve many of the problems in our society. They were supposed to eliminate car ownership. So, you know, the autonomous vehicle, the idea for it, the concept of it really comes along kind of after Uber starts to take off and really starts to take hold, right? And so they take that idea of, you can hail a vehicle from your phone and say, you can still do that, but now the vehicle will drive itself. There won't be any human driver. We won't have labor costs associated with that. And there'll just be a ton of them, and it'll be super convenient. It'll also eliminate parking, right? So these vehicles, they'll just kind of ply the roads all the time. They won't park anywhere. And so we'll have all this extra space that we can build on. They'll of course reduce, if not eliminate, vehicle deaths. That's of course the promise. We have yet to see the evidence that they'll be able to do that. And of course, we can see with Tesla vehicles that they still kill plenty of people pretty often. And of course, they're only a few years away. That was the promise back in 2012, 2013, 14, and you know, continues to this day. And there's still very few autonomous vehicles, so we still can't depend on them in any kind of mass transportation sort of way. You know, they've really not been able to deliver on these promises. And so, you know, for a number of years, there were a lot of promises made about these. And in 2018, we really had a kind of a wake up call. On March 18th of that year, an Uber test vehicle killed Elaine Herzberg in Arizona. And all of a sudden, you know, a lot of these big promises from the tech companies, from the Ubers, the Waymos, the Teslas, actually Tesla didn't moderate so much. Let me take that one back. But the other companies, all of a sudden, you know, they've been saying, these vehicles are right around the corner. They're going to have all these kind of incredible impacts that, you know, and solve all these problems. All of a sudden, you know, within weeks and months, they were all kind of pulling back on that, right? So the investigations into this report found that there was a lot of kind of pressure for for Uber in particular to keep up with competitors, you know, to move fast and break things. It doesn't matter what's going to happen. We just need to keep up. And the National Transportation Safety Board in the States found a whole range of problems with these systems. And then, of course, after that, the Waymo CEO, Waymo is the self-driving division at Google, said autonomy will always have constraints. This was very separate from what they were saying before that. Admitted that there'll be decades before they're widespread, and that they'll never be able to drive themselves any time of the year in any weather conditions. This is the kind of level 5 version of self-driving. The idea that, you know, you'll just create this vehicle, it won't have a steering wheel, it will be able to drive itself all the time, and a human will never have to interact with it or take over or be able to kind of, you know, have to drive it. And then the Volkswagen, an executive at Volkswagen who worked on this said level 5, again, that version I just told you about, will never happen globally. And he said it will be a minimum 5 years to further develop this technology for further cities. And he said that those cities will require 3D maps, you know, comprehensive 3D maps of the cities, perfect road conditions, really good weather conditions, very separate from what we were being told just a few months before. And of course, we can see that there's still difficulties in achieving these systems in cities, you know, where they're rolled out. And so what we see today, just last year, you know, there's been a real kind of change and an even further realization in this sector, where Ford and Volkswagen-backed Argo AI shut down. Argo AI was seen as kind of one of the leaders in this sector, backed by these automakers. Apple, of course, has scaled back its ambitions for self-driving cars until at least 2026. You know, I'd be surprised if we really see kind of their vision of what it would look like even then. In California, regulators are looking at Tesla even closer. You know, its autopilot and full self-driving system, saying that they are kind of misleading consumers with how they're advertised, followed on a similar ruling in Germany a couple of years ago. And the U.S. Safety regulators are looking at many different aspects of the Tesla business, and it's also facing a number of lawsuits for some of the deaths that have happened in recent years. I think we're going to be seeing more of that this year. And then, of course, in San Francisco and some other cities, General Motors and Waymo have rolled out kind of services that they're testing. And increasingly, they find, and the people in these cities say that these systems don't work nearly as well as these companies are kind of making it out in their public relations and their marketing campaigns, right? There are a lot of serious questions here. And lawmakers in San Francisco have even asked these services to be pulled off the road because of all the unexpected issues that they have and all the problems that they're causing in the transportation system. So it's a real break from the narrative that they're still trying to sell and the wider narrative that had been sold in the past of how self-driving cars were really going to upend transportation. And so I think the core for me is that tech fantasies distract from real solutions, right? We know that there are many ways that we can actually address all of the problems that I described earlier. But these things are not sexy. They don't involve kind of tech companies dreaming up new things and kind of vastly overpromising what they can deliver with these various technologies. They're very mundane things that we can do to address these problems. But they're often actions that people don't want to take because they're not as attractive, because they're not necessarily going to win you votes and get you a bunch of attention if you're a politician. And so it's much more difficult to push these things forward. If we look at specific examples, if we look at the Boring Company, for example, pushed by Elon Musk, there are a number of examples now where this idea of a tunnel being bored under a city for cars to drive through is kind of the idea of how we're going to solve traffic, right? And it's a completely unrealistic expectation. And in Fort Lauderdale, they were looking for a tunnel for a commuter train because they had to replace a bridge that their train goes over right now. And so they went to the Boring Company expecting, this will be a cheap way to get a tunnel. And what actually happened was they ended up selling the city a tunnel for Teslas to go to the beach, not a commuter train tunnel at all. And of course, the Hyperloop, which was an idea that was proposed by Elon Musk about a decade ago, and this was going to be like a really fast kind of vacuum tube train system that would, in his initial proposal, run from Los Angeles to San Francisco. What we know by looking at his biography and other statements that he's made was that the goal of that was really to stop California's high-speed rail system from being built, not to actually realize this kind of futuristic transportation system that he was promising. So again, it's distraction, it's delay, it's stopping things that could actually make things better for people by using tech fantasies to distract people. So I was in New Zealand just last week. I came back. And so I wanted to give you one example of how these things kind of continue to end off this conversation. And so this is a quote from Erica Stanford, who is a national MP in New Zealand. National is kind of like their Conservative Party. And so in this interview, they were talking about a light rail system that's being proposed in Auckland, which is the largest city in New Zealand. And so she was saying, in response to this and in opposition to it, with the technology that's coming down the line, are we going to be committed to a fixed rail, old technology mode of transport? There's all sorts of autonomous vehicles, and the fact that we've got this revolution of electric vehicles that is going to solve most of our emissions problems. There are some other options that we should be considering. So, the core of this is to say, wait, now we don't need to invest in public transit infrastructure because there's autonomous vehicles. They're still coming soon. We have these electric vehicles that are addressing emissions. People can still just keep driving their cars. Let's not kind of make investments to change this. You might say, why are you calling out something that's happened in New Zealand? Well, this is a story from 2018 in the New York Times, and it explains how the Koch brothers, which are, one of them is dead now, but they are essentially really wealthy billionaires, libertarian right-wing billionaires in the United States who make their money off of fossil fuels and the automotive industry. And they have been funding efforts across the United States to stop efforts or to stop campaigns to build more public transit. And in this article, you'll see in the second sentence there, they say Americans for Prosperity, which is one of the organizations they fund, counters that public transit plans waste taxpayer money on unpopular, outdated technology like trains and buses, just as the world is moving toward cleaner driverless vehicles. So this is an explicit kind of argument that has been used by the right in many countries around the world. And it's these technologies, these kinds of distractive technologies, I would say, that are utilized in this way to campaign against real solutions that can solve real problems. And so I think that if we really want to address these problems, we need to know that, right? And so I think that, if we keep being distracted by these things, we're headed toward a more dystopian future where we don't actually solve these fundamental problems, but are more distracted by things that are coming out of the tech industry, right? You can see tunnels for vehicles that connect up gated communities. So these wealthy people are further kind of distance from the rest of the public, people that they want to be nowhere near. We know that Elon Musk's first kind of vision for a Boring Company tunnel was not something that was really going to serve the public, but it was to run between his home in Los Angeles to the SpaceX headquarters. Now, of course, he lives in Texas, so it's completely different, but that was the vision, right? And of course, he's proposing electric vehicles, the Cybertruck, with bulletproof glass and enhanced security features like dent-proof panels. This is not the vision of like a vehicle that is kind of about a better world or something like that. It's very, there's a particular idea here of the kind of society that you're living in if you're trying to protect yourself in this kind of way, driving a massive vehicle like this. And of course, renewables and battery storage are part of the solution, but you can see how for some of these wealthy people, it's a vision of, ensuring that they still have, access to energy and things like that. So as one academic called it, grid defection, so that they don't need to rely on the energy grid as a whole. They can supply themselves, to further kind of opt out of the general society. And so, I'm worried about where these things are headed if we don't push back against these trends. And so ultimately, I think we have a decision as to, what is the future kind of transportation system that we're looking for? Are we going to be dependent on cars, cars with some new technologies that are being built into them, but still, cars at the end of the day that still have many of the same problems that we've been facing now for quite a long time? Or, do we kind of reinvest in public transportation, make more investments in cycling infrastructure, look at the way that we built our communities and consider whether we can build them in other ways, so that they're not so focused around forcing people into dependence on cars? I think that's really kind of a bigger question that we're facing right now. And I don't think that technology, or at least not technology alone, is how we're going to solve that. That's a real political problem, not a technological one. And so thank you for the presentation. I think I went a bit over time, apologies. But yeah, so that's my take on this. More than happy to answer questions.